progress.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Ava's webinar today. It's great to have you all here. As you come into the session, please feel free to introduce yourselves using the chat function. Should be at the top of your or the bottom of your screen. Great to know who we've got here, perhaps what organisation you work for, what your role is. Always nice to know who we've got joining us. I'll get it started. I'll send a good morning message in the chat, and then please do start introducing yourselves. Always nice to hear where everybody is coming from professionally. Great. Okay, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Ava's session. Today, we will be focusing on recognising and understanding trauma-related behaviour in the classroom. Something that I'm sure, as you're all here, you appreciate is highly important as we move forward to kind of appreciating the importance of mental health within that school setting and the significant role of trauma. So just to introduce myself, my name's Hannah. I'm an associate trainer with Ava, and my background is working on gender-based violence with children and adults, so experiences of gender-based violence and providing prevention and response support services. Today, the webinar will be an hour and a half. So the presentation will be just over an hour, and then we'll open up to Q&As. So as we go along, feel free to jot down your questions, or you can put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll work through those at the end. Also very open to you sharing kind of any reflections in the Q&A or within the chat function. Just ask that you obviously don't share any information that might identify anyone that you're supporting or working with. Okay. So before we dive into the content, I just want to highlight your well-being. So obviously trauma is an emotive topic. It's probably something that you are all working on professionally. Some of us might have personal experiences. So I just want to say that please do look after yourselves. If you do need to take a break from the session, please step out. And I have also popped some suggested support numbers here on the screen. So if you feel like they might be helpful to you after the session or later in the day, then please do utilise those. I'll leave them on the screen for a second, if in case you want to kind of jot down those support numbers. The other important thing to say is that because of the content that we'll be covering today, what the subject we'll be exploring, it's really important that you attend in a space away from any children in your home or in your school setting, work setting. So I will share the slides with you after today, and any resources that we discussed that I mentioned, also share those with you. Today, what we'll be doing initially is discussing trauma and also developmental trauma. So when trauma happens early on in life, we'll then look at some kind of practical skills for supporting children who have experienced trauma and perhaps that's playing out currently in their life, in their classroom. And how to kind of support those children. We'll look at a few tools that you can kind of take away and use in your everyday practice, and those will be shared with you as well after the session. So hopefully that covers everything, and we can get started. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so The specific reason for holding the event today is because currently we are within the period of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So this is 16 days. It starts on the 25th of November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. And it runs to the 10th of December, which is the International Day of Human Rights. So we're specifically holding it here to kind of recognise and highlight the current campaign. And later on after today, we'll kind of share some resources in case you want to learn a bit more about the event and share with others and get involved perhaps. So I think another thing that's really important to highlight at the start of the session is to say that now in the UK, there is a new Domestic Abuse Act 2021 that came into force. And within that, which is particularly relevant to today's session, is that children are now recognised as victims of domestic abuse. And this is whether a child sees, hears, or experiences the effects of domestic abuse. Okay. We say that because so many, the experiences within a classroom, it's possible that you have about 1 in 5 children who are or have experienced domestic abuse at home. So within in terms of child trauma, domestic abuse is quite a strong element or strong kind of factor in children's experiences of trauma. All right, so we're going to start off by ensuring we're all on the same page and we have an understanding of trauma. So trauma, there's a few quotes here by some leading kind of professionals in the kind of trauma sector. So Bessel van der Kolk, he wrote The Body Keeps the Score, which if you want to kind of dive in deeper to what we cover today, is very much a recommended read. He describes trauma as an inescapable stressful event that overwhelms people's coping mechanisms. Judith Herman, another lead in the trauma sector, she says trauma confronts human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evokes responses of catastrophe. When we talk about trauma is really, really diverse. It's very individual. So people will respond to trauma in their own individual way. That will depend on their personality, their life experience, particularly their early life experiences, and significantly actually the support that they've received after the trauma. So having a support network, being able to kind of process and share that experience is a real buffer in terms of that trauma being less significant in terms of its impact, okay? When we think about trauma, there's different ways that somebody could be traumatized. So somebody could directly experience a traumatic event, okay? So that could be something like domestic abuse, it could be a car accident, it could be an incident of an attack, an assault. They could also witness the traumatic event happening in person, okay? So they could see it happening to somebody else, being a witness. They could also learn about something traumatic happening to somebody that they're close to, so a family member or a close friend. And then also, obviously, as professionals working and hearing trauma, we can also experience secondary trauma. So where a story or a story, so perhaps multiple experiences of hearing trauma and people's stories can have an impact on our well-being in the form of secondary trauma. We can become traumatized. So those are the different ways that trauma can impact somebody. In terms of the complexity of trauma, as I said, trauma is very individual. So people will respond in their own individual ways. For example, you might have siblings in a home that experience domestic abuse, and their response to that trauma can be very, very different, okay? In terms of how they cope, how impactful it is on them. But what we do know is there's certain things that can make a trauma more impactful. So for example, if it was caused by humans rather than a natural disaster, that's likely, generally speaking, to be more traumatic. What we see, for example, is that there's a natural disaster, there's collective support after that, it's experienced by many. That's a real buffer in terms of that experience becoming traumatic. Also, if it's caused by somebody known to the survivor, rather than if it's a stranger, that's likely to be more impacted. So somebody that you should have been able to trust. If it's a repeated incident, if it occurs in a safe environment, somewhere that has previously been safe or should be safe. So for example, in your home. Also, if it's, for example, rape or sexual violence. If there's continued contact also with the perpetrator, the individual that perpetrated that abuse. And like I mentioned earlier, in terms of like that natural disaster, so if it was another experience that was experienced by many, that would kind of likely create some buffer for the trauma. Also, if there's little sympathetic support for that individual, yeah. So if there's, say, for example, there's experiences of childhood gender-based violence, and it's not, it's rejected. So even a child might go to somebody and tell them, and that is kind of pushed back and not believed, say, for example. Or you're in a society where it just wouldn't be possible for you to tell somebody about that. And then a final factor that can make it quite significant is a previous history of abuse or violence. So we know that the early years, up to, I think we all know that up to about 5 is quite significant in a child's life. So trauma early on like that can have a real significant impact on later well-being. So it can kind of increase the risk of latent vulnerability for children. But actually new research is showing us that actually the first few months are the most significant in terms of the impact on a child's later well-being. So today we're focusing on that trauma that occurs early on in a child's life. So I think what's really helpful here is to understand a little bit about the brain. So I find that a helpful way to think about it is to think about the brain as being like a 3-story house, effectively. So you've got the brainstem at the bottom floor is the brainstem. Now this is responsible for survival. That this part of the brain is developed before a child is born. It's developed in utero, okay, and it's that survival part. So it's where your amygdala is, which is effectively your brain's fire alarm that activates if you pick up on danger. Okay, the middle floor is your limbic part of the brain. This starts to develop from about 9 months old, and it's responsible for attachment and emotional development. Okay, and then you've got the cortical part of the brain, which is your top floor. Now, interestingly, this continues to develop until we're in our mid-20s. Okay, and it's responsible for learning, being creative, problem solving, making decisions. Okay, now what we see when trauma occurs early on in life is what could happen is developmental trauma, yeah, where a child can get quite stuck in the lower part of the brain. So if trauma occurs, yeah, what we know is in the moment of trauma, the upper brain disconnects from the lower part of the brain, okay? And this is because the survival part of the brain takes over and it initiates that kind of fight, flight, freeze response, depending on which is most likely to ensure that person's survival, okay? Now, what can happen is, particularly if the trauma is ongoing, a child can get quite stuck in the lower part of the brain. So they're in survival mode, kind of on an ongoing basis, very alert to danger, okay? And this can mean that the upper parts of the brain, there's not really much space for them to develop and grow. Yes, for them to develop skills in and understanding their emotions, regulating their emotions, learning at school, having that brain space to be creative, to problem solve. And what we call that is developmental trauma, where trauma occurs early on and it impacts the development of the brain in the way that we would want it to develop. And it's really important to highlight that that's not conclusive. So work can be done, and that work would need to be done collectively with the adults and the professionals within that child's life, including kind of a therapeutic element. So this is effectively how the brain develops and how trauma can kind of impact the development of the brain. What I'm going to show you now is a beautiful animation by a therapeutic center and an organization that specializes in early trauma, that looks at what we've just said, but it kind of puts it in a quite a nice way, and it touches on the window of tolerance. Window of tolerance is really effectively this space where we can live comfortably in terms of our mental well-being. And what happens when trauma occurs, it can be quite difficult for survivors to stay on a daily basis within this window of tolerance. So they might fluctuate to hypo and hyperarousal, okay? It's thought that we're born with virtually no window of tolerance. And based on the attachment that we develop with our caregivers, that window of tolerance grows. So positive attachment and safety, physical, emotional safety early on in life will enable that window to grow wider than somebody that didn't have that earlier on in life. Okay, so let's have a few minutes, sit back, relax, watch the animation, and we'll pull it all together after. So there you go. A lovely animation. Thank you, Rob. You liked it? From Beacon House. So hopefully that kind of nicely pulls it together, particularly if you're a visual learner. I think the other thing to kind of add to here is to highlight trauma memory. So traumatic memory is not processed in the way that other memories are. So it's effectively stored in a sensory way, so through visuals, smells, sounds, tastes, which is why trauma memories can be quite unexpectedly triggered. So for example, if you have a child who's living at home where there's domestic abuse, and for example, you're in the classroom and suddenly a door slams really loudly, and for the child this kind of unconsciously reminds them of all those loud noises that they hear at home. Yeah, so it triggers them into kind of almost that, like, almost as if they're re-experiencing the trauma that they hear that they're experiencing at home, or did experience at home. And perhaps it activates their flight response, and they run out the classroom, for example. Now the thing here is that if we're trauma informed and we have an understanding of trauma, how it plays out in behavior, we can look at that and say, okay, perhaps that child has been triggered. Yeah, when we don't do that, we end up labeling a child as naughty or misbehaving or disruptive. Yeah, so it's really important that we look beyond that behavior and we look at kind of what might be beneath it, what the thoughts, the feelings, the prior experiences might be below that behavior. Okay. So the other thing to highlight here is that there's this, what you see here on the screen is the polyvagal theory. Okay, so basically what we've learned in more recent years is that when we pick up on danger, our initial response is to turn to somebody that we trust, for that safety, for that support. Okay, if that doesn't work, we mobilize our fight or flight response. Okay, and if that is not effective, if we can't escape the danger, we kind of freeze, we go into that collapse mode. Now what we know is that children, as well as adults really, who experience say social engagement as repeatedly being ineffective, will kind of tend to automatically go straight to fight flight. And again, if that doesn't work repeatedly, they might tend to veer automatically to going to a kind of a freeze, a collapse state. Okay, but just a note here on the collapse: if a child is experiencing, abuse at home, so it's ongoing abuse, and they are, automatically tending to go into that freeze collapse state, that would really we would call that a dissociation. Really, the thing with dissociation is in the moment of trauma, it can be a really valuable tool to cope with the trauma that you're experiencing. Yeah, so you can't physically remove yourself, but you can remove your mind. Yeah, the thing with dissociation is what tends to happen is that tendency to dissociate when the danger occurs can play out in other parts of that child's life. So they might spontaneously dissociate in the classroom while they're learning, when somebody's talking to them. Yeah, and again, that goes back to us as professionals, making that connection between trauma and behavior, and looking below the surface to what that child who doesn't seem to be focusing, what that's really means, what's actually going on there. So here we've got kind of some examples really of like what a child might experience, or what's being done to them, and how that might have altered their beliefs or their thinking. So, for example, emotional abuse, perhaps insults, being ignored, that might play out in them feeling that they're bad or worthless, that they're not wanted or loved. They perhaps shouldn't be alive. So physical abuse, maybe that kind of sense that the world is a dangerous place. I'm bad and I'm powerless. So perhaps that sense of like feeling physically and emotionally not safe, that the world is not a safe place. Sexual violence, that sense of destroyed innocence or not being able to trust anybody else. Neglect, so no self-concept, not feeling that they matter, or life's hopeless, perhaps feelings of not being in existence. A chaotic environment, so like, for example, lots of different carers, lots of different frequent moves, for example, perhaps an inner sense of not feeling safe or secure, or feeling quite terrified by the world around you. And then trauma, so perhaps that sense that they, in that moment that they're going to die, when those kind of triggers come up again, those triggers can be very real and feel like that trauma is re-happening, they're re-experiencing. Or that sense of I could disappear. So I think it's really healthy as professionals to, when we see some of this behavior, that's, it's fine to recognize that trauma behavior can be difficult, and to think about what might be going on internally for that child, what their belief sets might be, what their thought processes might be. To pull this all together, I want to show you this animation, which has been developed by the UK Trauma Council. I think it kind of hopefully draws together very well what we've been talking about. So again, sit back, relax, and watch. Take note of what you can take, what you can learn from it. Perhaps reflect on your professional practice as we watch it, and see if there's anything that you could do to enhance your practice when working with trauma.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
Okay, so I hope that was helpful and kind of pieced it, that understanding of trauma and its impacts together. Do reflect on what that means for you in your practice and any things that you might want to tweak in terms of enhancing your practice. Okay, so I think the other thing that's important that we touch on here is ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So just think for a moment, in your practice, are you using ACEs? Are they helpful? And also, do they have limitations? So ACEs is which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, is, like I said, adverse childhood experiences, and it's the ones that you see here on the screen. I think what's important is that we appreciate ACEs is valuable in understanding trauma, but also that we recognise that, like we discussed earlier on, that trauma is very individual and people respond and cope very differently. So personality will play an impact, resilience, early life experiences, and that support network, the support that's received after the trauma. Yeah, does the individual have a strong supportive adult in their life, for example? So if we only look at ACEs and we look at kind of like specific experiences, we miss out that individual and how they've actually been impacted by their experience. And we could fall into the kind of the whole of categorizing people by their experience, as opposed to seeing them as an individual and as somebody who's had an experience, but how have they as an individual responded? You know, what resilience do they have? What's their personality? What support have they got? It's really important to look deeper than that experience of trauma. Okay. So on that note, we're going to take a short break, so that you can process what we've covered. So if we can come back at 10:47, let's do that. Very specific, but so go and get coffee, whatever you need, step outside for some fresh air. And when you come back, we will start looking at like the practical ideas around supporting children in school, in a classroom. See you shortly. Okay. Okay, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully that was enough time to grab a coffee or whatever you needed to do. So we're going to look now at supporting children in that school classroom context. We'll touch on that a bit, and then we'll open up to some discussion, some questions, and any reflections that you have as well. So I think the chat should be working now, so please do try to utilize it, and feel free to kind of add your comments and chat away amongst you. Okay, so building on what we've just been discussing, I want to kind of put this analogy forward to you. So we often see behavior in isolation, you know, from those kind of thoughts and feelings that are kind of, if you like, going on below the surface of the water. So if you can think of an iceberg, yeah, so the actual tip of the iceberg above the water represents behavior that we see, that maybe we find difficult, that we find challenging, overwhelming at times. But the key here is to not just look at the surface, not just look at the behavior. We want to go below the surface, you know. It's an iceberg, huh? There's a big chunk of it under the water. And below the water really is those feelings that are connected with that behavior, those thoughts that are connected with behavior. And really crucially, those life experiences, beliefs that have come out from those experiences, and values. Okay, so if we just look at the behavior, we risk labeling that behavior in an unhelpful way. Yeah, so if we just label the child who ran out of the classroom as naughty or disruptive, rather than questioning what's going on for that child, what might he have been thinking or feeling, what experiences might, you know, connect with that behavior, we could be doing more harm unintentionally. Okay. So we really want to be working in a trauma-informed way. And language is really, really key to that. Okay, so this approach shifts away from, you know, viewing somebody as what's wrong with them to what's happened to them. So working in a trauma way really requires a shift in our thinking and our language. You know, unfortunately, the behaviours and responses to those with trauma experiences are often, you know, misunderstood and labelled in stigmatizing or unhelpful ways. And really, practitioners play a very important role in offering another way to understand trauma responses as really an attempt to cope or adapt to kind of the overwhelming impact of trauma, and in fact, effectively normal responses to an abnormal event. So if we have a look here, we've got that diagnosis, but also label of ADHD. And rather than assuming that, could it actually be that they're actually reacting to trauma? Yeah, there's also a growing body of research that is suggesting that sometimes ADHD is diagnosed when actually it could be a misdiagnosis, and the actual what's going on is actually trauma. Rather than they've got anger management problems, perhaps they've actually got difficulty regulating their emotions because of their early experiences and the impact on their brain development. They're disruptive, but actually maybe, you know, they've been triggered, like the example we've given about the boy in the classroom. They've got poor coping skills, but actually, you know, they've got survival skills. Let's not talk about it, but actually talking gives permission to heal. Talking is, if it's at that individual's pace, and it's led by them, it can actually be, you know, a form or an element of recovery. They're permanently damaged, but actually rather they can learn, heal and recover. Rather than they need consequences, they actually need support, routine and self-worth. And on that note, what's really important actually is when a child has experienced trauma, they need logical consequences, yeah, to rebuild pathways in the brain. So say, for example, if a child throws something across the classroom, and they are, you know, put in a corner of the room for quiet time. And that's not perfect, because really what we want is a child who's experienced trauma probably has a heightened sense of shame. So really what we want to do is, rather than time out, we want time in. So we want to stay with that child, yeah, while they are after that incident. The other thing we want to do is we want to help them to feel remorse and correct or repair what they've done. So we want to ideally help them to think about what they could do to correct the issue. So maybe maybe they need to go and pick up the book and return it, and we don't want to force them to say sorry either. Yeah, we want to help them to feel remorse. So helping them at the right time, when they've calmed down, when they've got their upper brain online, getting them to think about how they would feel if their book had been thrown across the classroom, or they had been impacted by somebody doing that. Yeah, so it's that kind of stuff that we want. We want natural consequences. We want them to help them kind of feel remorse, and we want to help them to repair things, not just tell them to say sorry when they're not feeling that. So there's some kind of thoughts. I appreciate that some of this stuff is hard in that classroom when you have got, 30 kids. But this is kind of ideally the ideals of what we want to be working towards. So in terms of that kind of support to a traumatized child, what's really helpful is helping a child who's been triggered. For example, something's happened in the classroom, it's triggered that sense of trauma that's going on in their life, or did happen in their life. We want them to help them to calm the lower part of the brain, the brainstem. And what we know is that things that can help to do that are rhythmic patterned activities. So it could be going for a walk, it could be tapping, drumming, something rhythmic, playing, singing, or humming, something like this. Could be running. It really depends on that child. There's so many possibilities in terms of things that could calm the lower part of the brain, sorry. But definitely kind of something rhythmic, something that connects and works for that child. It's also really important to think about that some things could actually be triggering for a child. So what you need to do is you really need to know that child and what helps them to calm down, to ground them back to the now, and enable them to kind of bring their upper brain back online. When they're in the lower part of their brain, the brainstem, there's also no point in having conversations about behavior, because they're not in the right space, yeah, to engage and process and have those conversations. So that needs to come when you've helped them to kind of feel more grounded. So know when they have been triggered and help them to regulate. So if you know a child is struggling in your class or has experienced trauma, try to understand what their triggers are, try to minimize the risks of those triggers. You probably can't rule that out, but there's probably things that you could do to minimize that. And then, help them to regulate when you see those indicators in them, and stay with them as best you can. I know some schools have a calm space in their school where children who do need that, who have experienced trauma or experienced difficulties, can go to. So it's a safe, comfortable, emotionally, physically safe space where they can go and they can calm down. That works in some schools. It works for many children. Really important to stay regulated. You cannot ground the child if you are not regulated yourself. So that's really important. Okay. Don't punish behavior that are trauma symptoms. And I appreciate also that can be difficult in a class context when you're trying to treat children equally. So that's something that maybe is something to take back to your school and discuss in terms of how that can be managed. Yeah, like I mentioned, use logical consequences. Use time in rather than time out. You don't want to leave a traumatized child in their shame on their own. Yeah, leaving them on their own after they've done something that's not right will exacerbate their probably existent sense of shame. So it's best that you stay with them through that. The other thing that's really helpful for children who have experienced trauma is predictability and structure in their life. That can help to rebuild a sense of safety in terms of their environment, their emotional, physical safety. Connected relationships, that's something that's really foundational to recovery. Having a supportive adult in your life that you connect with. Yeah. Trauma is often about a lack of power. So really with traumatized children, within those boundaries, within reason, we want to enable as much choice as possible. You know, obviously remembering that they're children and they need boundaries and they need rules, but trying to kind of bear that in mind, and being conscious of those power dynamics that do exist as professionals and as a child. You know, trauma can, as we said, trauma can impact brain development, including their social and emotional skills. So really also as professionals, we want to be supporting children to rebuild those social connections in school that they might really be struggling with, and also those emotional skills. Validating the different feelings that they do have as well. We all have feelings, and validating them knowing that it's safe to have all these different feelings is also important. Okay. So on the screen here, this is another resource from Beacon House. You'll see some different ideas here. So you've got some indicators of spotting that fight mode, spotting flight, and spotting freeze and collapse mode, and some ideas around grounding. So this is a tool that you'll have to take away with you today. So it details those indicators that a child might be in fight mode. So perhaps, for example, they're disruptive, they're angry, argumentative, unable to follow any rules in the home, they're quite hot and bothered, maybe they've told a lie or they're blaming, they seem quite controlling, yeah, or inflexible. And then so some skills in grounding, that might be some deep breathing, something, food that's chewy, swinging perhaps. Some of these will not be practical in school, as in the bath, but it might be that, you know, obviously that you'd work with parents around some of these ideas. Something soft, a blanket perhaps in the, you know, in the calm school room. Give them an important task to do. Something self-soothing. So that's some ideas to go with. And like I said before, I think that you need to be mindful that some of these things could be calming for a child. They could work, they could also be triggering. So it's good to know that child and know what works for them, and to have that conversation with them at the right time. Okay, so just some kind of key points really, before we're going to shortly open up to some questions, some reflections, a bit of an open chat. So key things that we've gone through today. So the brain is a learning organ. So although trauma can impact the development, that's not conclusive, and work can be done with the professionals and that child, but I would say that needs to be done in partnership. Yeah, everybody involved in that child's life needs to be part of that process. The brain learns through trusted relationships. Yeah, having a solid, reliable adult who connects with you and cares about in your life is really important. Yeah, for prevention of trauma impacting a child, and also the recovery of that trauma. Brain adaptations may contribute to behaviour that we find difficult. And, you know, remember, when you feel overwhelmed by a child's behaviour, remember, if you can just remember to pause and remember that iceberg and try and work out what's going on beneath that behaviour. I think that can be really helpful, a real helpful visual to bring in when you're in that moment and you yourself are overwhelmed. So remember that by responding differently, we can create different outcome for children. So it's really, if we respond in a trauma-informed way, it's really an opportunity to shape that child's opportunities. And I think we saw that in the video with the swimming teacher, where initially the child was punished and removed from the pool, but the second time there was some thinking going on internally for her. And she was more understanding, and she thought deeper about what was going on for that child. So our well-being is socially created, so opportunities for new learning exist through relationships, and solutions can be created within the social context. And obviously your self-care is important. So who's around to support you? If you're working with children who've experienced trauma, if you're hearing the impacts of that, if you're working with hearing the stories or experiencing the behavior that's coming out because of that trauma, what's available for you organizationally? What support do you have available for your staff if somebody is impacted? I think that supervision can be a really valuable way of processing some of that trauma. I think that you hear that's processing it, talking it through in a safe, confidential space can be really effective in terms of minimizing that risk of that impacting you. Yeah. And well-being is a team effort. So noticing in your colleagues when somebody needs that space to talk or needs a breather, looking after one another is really important. So take a few moments now to think about what we've covered. Get a pen and paper and have a think about what you'll take away from today to help you as an individual professional within your practice. What have you taken from today that you want to implement in your practice, that you want to go away and reflect on? And also, is there anything that you could take back to your school or your organisation that you want to take back to the team meeting, for example, to enhance your approach to working with children who've experienced trauma? And do feel free now to put your thoughts in the chat if you want to, no pressure. But if you'd like to share, then please do so. Take a minute to do that, and then we'll open up to some questions. Yeah, pop some stuff in the chat so I know you're there. Right, chat's not where. Yeah. All right, everyone. Chat, problem with chat. Let's have a look. Hold on, apologies. Okay, we do have, but the Q&A is working. I'm sorry if the chat is not working perfectly well. People are writing in the Q&A, so if you want to put questions, reflections in there, I will work through them and share them out, and we'll have a chat. Okay, apologies about the chat. I think it's something on the other side that I can't quite alter here, I'm afraid. But yeah, you're all writing in the Q&A, so let's go with that. Okay, so somebody is keen on the Beacon House resources. absolutely, we can share that with you. But you can have also some very specific specific resources on supporting schools. So absolutely, we can kind of direct you to those. Okay, so somebody's commenting on that kind of maybe that change in practice in terms of like that it can be quite common to send a child to another space, but that it's helpful to learn about that's not necessarily best practice. It's better to kind of stay with them, so that they can kind of process and be supported through that. Great. Okay, keep your questions coming in. Somebody's asking about could sleep training, as in leaving a baby to cry for short periods of time, be a mild cause of trauma during the development of the limbic brain? So it's a really very, very specific, tricky question. I think that that's a very hard one, because it depends what the wider context is really. If the child is experiencing other forms of neglect or abuse, then that could compound it. I think what we understand actually is, in terms of parents getting it right, parents need to kind of only get it right in terms of about 30 or 40% of the time. So that's not too bad. It's quite reassuring, isn't it, as a parent? Anyway, hope it is for everybody else who's a parent. So I think it's a very tricky one, really. That's it could be perhaps for some children, but I think if they're getting other needs met, and they've got a safe home that they're living in, then that would be a strong offer, really. And I know that this technique is often it's quite a common technique that's utilized in parenting, and parenting is a tricky one, isn't it? It's always evolving, and different ways of parenting is kind of, we're all learning different ways of parenting, and I think there's lots of different beliefs around that. So I think it's a tricky one. I hope that kind of answers the question a little bit. So somebody's saying that your school don't consider what is causing the underlying behaviours. How can I get them to think beyond the behaviour? I mean, I think maybe it's a positive idea to kind of take some of the tools that we've looked at today into a team meeting. Could also propose an AVA training for your organisation. I'm sure we'd be very happy to come and deliver a session on this if the desire was there. But I think initiating those conversations, maybe about the iceberg, maybe about just connecting. I think just sharing some knowledge with your colleagues around how trauma might kind of play out, and what actually happens to the brain when trauma occurs. My observations as professionals is that can really enhance some empathy around behaviour and more patience. So I think that's perhaps the starting block in that sense. So I'm just going through your questions. So somebody said that they're going to reflect on their practice, trying to remember, Bernadette, sorry, reflect on their practice and try to remember that the very thing I'm using to help a child calm down may be triggering. Yeah. So yeah, having that conversation with the child in terms of what helps them to feel more grounded, and noticing if you're trying something and it's not quite working for them, is going to be really important in terms of their well-being and the rapport that you're building up with them. Okay, so people are providing some positive feedback around what we've covered, which is great. Yeah, Isabel highlighting that trauma is ongoing. Yeah, that's really important. It's a really important lesson to take away, isn't it? Trauma is actually not really about what happened, it's about what happens after and how that person is impacted by the incident that occurred. Yeah, remembering how it can kind of play out, how it can, impact how the brain functions going forward. Yeah, so Antonia saying about knowing about the rhythm to engage the brain is brilliant. Yeah, that's really helpful. There's some good resources on that actually, just some basic guidance, which I can share with you after the session. So Jane's saying that in their school they set up a trauma a space, a safe space in the classroom, and it works for children, not just the children who have experienced trauma. Great. It's nice to hear that somebody's kind of highlighting that they're doing that and it's working well. And I think also the other thing that makes me that prompts me with what Jane said is that you won't necessarily know who in your classroom has experienced trauma. You might at some point it might become apparent, but approaching what you do in a trauma-informed way, assuming that there will be trauma experiences in your classroom and that might not have been identified yet, is really important. Oh, that's an interesting question. So somebody's asking about do different gender brains develop in different ways to trauma? It's a very interesting question. I don't think that I'm not conscious of research that's been done in that way. It is an interesting question. I might have a little look and see if I can come across anything, but I think that there has been a body of research that's looked at how the differences in abuse and the impact on the brain and neglect. And I think what's come out of that is actually that interestingly, neglect can have a more significant impact, I believe, on the brain's development. Okay. Any other questions? Do pop them in the chat. And if anybody wants to raise their hand, I can pop your speaker on if you want to talk. Anybody want to do that? Don't have to put your video on, but if you'd like to share anything or ask a question, use the toolbar at the bottom to raise your hand and I can turn on your speaker. For those of you that joined a few minutes after I mentioned that I'll share the slides, just a reminder that we'll share the slides with you and the other resources that we've mentioned. If it's helpful, I'll also share there's an article on ACEs and maybe it's kind of imperfections, its limitations, which is quite useful in getting us thinking about not relying too heavily on ACEs. Obviously, it's a really valuable tool, but it's important to be conscious of its limitations. Any other questions? No? I'm going to share the last slide now, just to highlight that if you're a professional working in a London-based school or with young people, and you'd like to find out more about the Healthy London, healthy relationships, project is strengthening schools' response to tackling and preventing violence against women and girls, then we'll send you the information after the session, but you can kind of have a little bit more of a look into that. And do reach out if you fit that criteria and you're interested in learning more. The other thing to mention is we love feedback. We want to enhance our trainings and ensure that they meet what you need as professionals. So we will send you a feedback form and really appreciate your feedback, so that we know how we can kind of enhance and make sure that we're covering what you need from us. Okay, so a desire for the ACEs article, no problem at all. Got a list of things I'll share. Okay. I would say also that on a few slides back, there was a visual, sorry, of what do I do? Trauma-informed support for children. That's quite a good tool, and what I would say with that is to go away with it, have a look at the 7 different elements of it, and see what, maybe pick 3 things that you could be doing more of, or things that you could kind of initiate or enhance in your practice, so that you can be supporting children who experience trauma as best you can. So little piece of homework there for you. Okay, so one other thing that's come, a couple other things that have come through. So it's really hard for staff to keep the child in the class as it affects the rest of the class, but we'll try to encourage teachers to create a space. Yeah, a space, a room. I appreciate that it's quite hard to manage those kind of situations when you've got like a whole big group of children. But yeah, creating a space that feels like physically, emotionally safe for children when they are triggered is a really, really valuable idea. Think about what, calming colours, for example, soft cushionings, what's going to be good for a child who's triggered. So there's a question here about gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is used along violence against women and girls. They're simultaneously used effectively. What's important here, that we're not mentioning boys and men. We do appreciate that boys and men can experience gender-based violence, but what we know is that the majority of victims or survivors of gender-based violence are women and girls. Women and girls are more at risk of experiencing gender-based violence. Okay, so any final questions before we finish up? Put them in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, we can share. There's a question about research on stats related to gender-based violence. Yeah, absolutely. We can kind of pull something out and share that with you. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today and getting really involved in all your questions. I hope I've covered everything that was needed. And like I said, we'll follow up with those resources that we talked about. And do check out Ava's website. We do have other trainings around trauma, around gender-based violence. So yeah, if some of those kind of interest you, then have a little dabble, have a look. what's available. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Do remember, if you feel impacted by anything that we've covered, do reach out for support. Mind charity is a good one in terms of mental well-being, for example. Okay, thanks everyone. Yeah, hope to see you again in the future, other AVA trainings. Someone's asking if you get a certificate for today. I'm not sure, because it's a webinar. Usually that would be for a training. If you do, we'll share that via email. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Rob, very much. A few more people here. Any final questions, those of you that are still here? Okay. Rob, thank you so much for working with me on that. Great job. Oh, one more person. Okay, all gone. Let's stop the recording as well. Stop the recording. Stop recording. Okay.